And I believe that means that we are live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Women's Month webinar with the European Union Delegation here in South Africa in association with the Mail and Guardian, bringing you this live webinar, and the title being The Impact of COVID-19 on Women and Their Businesses. An important topic, specifically it being Women's Month, but an important topic I feel at any time of the year. And we have gathered between the European Union Delegation in South Africa as well as the Mail and Guardian, we have gathered a wonderful panel of experts and interesting women in their own rights and in their own fields to really dissect what has gone from being a very serious issue to really being a crisis as a result of the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown. So without any further introduction, my name is Marcel Gordon. Some of you might know me as an anchor at a television news channel, ENCA. But today I'm merely a moderator. I'm the foil to ensure that we try and dissect this topic in the best possible way so that we can really get to the source of what the issues are, and most importantly, what the way forward is. And our hosts today are actually the European Union Delegation here in South Africa, who are doing amazing work, not just this webinar. They've had a wonderful program of events during the month of August, which is Women's Month here in South Africa. And they call themselves Team Europe here in South Africa. And they've had some great events. They've had arts, they've had academia, they've had workshops, they've had outreach, and they've had webinars of this kind, really trying to touch all those important landmarks during this important month in South Africa, and all of the members of the European Union really putting up their hands and getting involved at a very local level. And we're very honored because representing the European Union Delegation in South Africa is with us today. We've got the ambassador for the European Union here in South Africa, Dr. Rina Kionka, who arrived in South Africa late last year. She made her presentations to President Cyril Ramaphosa in October last year. And unfortunately, Dr. Kionka, you've spent most of your time so far as the ambassador in lockdown because of this pandemic. Allow me to hand over to you so that you can introduce us for the rest of this afternoon's event.
Thank you, Marcel. And I have to say that even in lockdown, South Africa is beautiful. But thank you for the intro words and the kind words on behalf of Team Europe, which consists of the EU and all its member states. We really have pulled together during this Women's Month to try to put something meaningful on the screen, so to speak, as we're not meeting in person yet. And it's my privilege to welcome everybody who's listening, who's watching at home to this Women's Month program and this webinar. And let me take this opportunity as well to thank our three terrific speakers. I'm looking very much forward to a robust discussion and exchanges with them and with you, our audience. But the question remains, why this webinar, why on this topic, and why at this very time? Well, for me, it's a no-brainer. We all know that the lockdown has brought about a sharp drop in production and employment, especially among those working in small and micro businesses. As many as 3 million people are thought to have lost their jobs. Of them, 2 million are thought to be women. Governments around the world have addressed the impacts of job losses due to COVID in various ways. And here in South Africa, the biggest stimulus was through an expansion of UIF payments and the mobilization of substantial private sector funding to assist small businesses. But that just applies to job losses in the formal sector, and it's much worse, as we all know, in the informal sector and for very small businesses and for those who are self-employed, who often fall between the cracks of systems designed actually to support businesses. Women have been hit disproportionately. They often do not belong to unemployment insurance schemes and do not qualify for formal loans. And add to that mix what income loss means for female-headed households. Add to the mix the reality that most women carry a disproportionate burden of unpaid work including homeschooling, caring for the elderly, caring for those who have fallen ill. Add to the mix the rise in reported GBV incidents on top of South Africa's already alarming high rates of violence against women and girls. In the EU, we speak very often about the need to go for a just and sustainable recovery from COVID. And I'm gratified to hear this increasingly here as well from leading voices in South Africa. Now, the term just and sustainable recovery is usually code for referring to green transition processes that address also job concerns. But, and I think this comes to the crux of our webinar today, it also means that unless and until we face the facts and put women and girls at the center of fiscal and social protection measures, we all lose. There's nothing just or sustainable about solutions that treat half the population as an afterthought. The EU has committed over R500 million rands to support the government and civil society in South Africa in this post-COVID era. Aligned with the EU Gender Action Plan and the SDG agenda, our programs seek to mainstream gender equity and aim to maximize the potential of women and girls, because that maximizes the potential, in fact, of society as a whole in all its diversity. Let me close by noting that COVID does not only challenge global public health systems, it also tests our humanity. The great French writer and philosopher Albert Camus, who was born on African soil in Algeria, hit the nail on the head when he wrote, and I quote, "It may seem like a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency." End of quote. So I wish all of us a fruitful afternoon today. Thank you very much, Marcel.
Thank you for those words. That's Dr. Irina Kionka. She's the EU ambassador to South Africa. She will stay with us on the panel. You might not be able to see her immediately, but all the time, as it were. But throughout the afternoon and as the discussions go along, we will call on her expertise. She indeed has worked in various parts of the world, and her expertise are far and wide. And specifically, I feel like she'd be able to make input in what similarities there are in the experiences that so many women are having to live through. Their lived experiences in various parts of the world, specifically in developing nations as well. So I'm sure we'll be able to get some input from her a little bit later on throughout this afternoon's webinar session. So we thank her for her time this afternoon and for hosting us with such an important issue. Allow me quickly, before we go on to our next speaker, just to introduce the rest of our panelists, and allow me to put them all on the screen in front of you. With us today, we also have Professor Daniela Casale. She is from the School of Economics and Finance at Witwatersrand University. We've got Zora Madikizela. She's the Access to Finance expert for the EU-funded Ecosystem Development for Small Enterprise program. And then we also have Tracy Chambers, who is the CEO of the Clothing Bank. And I'm very keen to find out more about the real grassroots experience that she and her team has had, not just with the Clothing Bank, but the various other hubs that they've started based on the experience that they've had working with women, specifically with the Clothing Bank, which they started back in 2010. So to allow you to get to grips with the expertise and the background of some of our panelists, let's call now on Professor Daniela Casale, Associate Professor at the School of Economics and Finance at WITS. And of particular interest will be the fact that Daniela is one of the very important researchers that are involved in a large data collection and research project, which is currently underway here in South Africa. We've had the first phase report that's already been published that has really brought home the horrors of what so many women in South Africa are living through because of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe the second phase report is about to be released soon. You can't ask for better data or research than the one that Daniela is part of. It is almost happening in real time, really bringing us to the pulse of what people are living through day to day, trying to put food on the table and to keep a roof over their families' heads. Professor Casale, over to you.
Thanks, Marcel. So as Marcel said, I'm going to share with you up front the broad picture of what's happened to women in South Africa as a result of COVID. Particularly, my research is focused on how COVID has affected gender inequalities in the labor market. And it's based on, as Marcel said, the survey called NIDS-CRAM that was conducted quite early in the lockdown period, and which tried to get at how the crisis was affecting South Africans' socioeconomic well-being and their labor market outcomes especially. What was unique about this survey, for people who are interested, I guess, in methodology, is that it interviewed a large number of South Africans, so 7,000, and we went to great efforts to try and ensure that it was nationally representative of the South African population. Unlike many of the kind of internet telephone surveys that are being conducted, where you're never quite sure whether they're representative of the whole population. Okay. And the results from wave one, which I'm going to describe now, are based we're very much focused on what happened in April. So that first month of the lockdown, which we in South Africa, given how strict the regulations were in that first report, which Dr. Kionka has already referred to, is that women in South Africa have been affected disproportionately by the crisis. So women suffered much greater job losses and much larger declines in hours worked than men in April. Dr. Kionka already referred to the figure that of the 3 million jobs lost in South Africa between February and April, 2 million were accounted for by women. Another way to describe that, to give you a sense of how disproportionate that is to say, well, pre-COVID in February, women accounted for less than half of total employment, okay? But they accounted for 2/3 of the job losses that occurred. And if I quote the same statistics for the US, you'll see just how big this effect is in South Africa. In the US, also, women accounted for less than half of total employment pre-COVID, and they were responsible for 55% of the job losses that occurred when the April jobs data came out. So you compare 55% in the US to 67% in South Africa. South African women are being hit very hard by this crisis. In fact, the New York Times came to call this crisis a she-cession, right, in recognition of this pronounced effect on women. And then the second key finding I want to raise is that not everyone has been affected equally. The most vulnerable have been most severely affected. So our data show that Black African women, women without a tertiary education, and women, very sadly, in the bottom third of the earnings distribution in February were hit hardest. I'm going to give you one very alarming statistic that emerged, which is that nearly half of women in that lowest third of the earnings distribution, so who were earning in the region of less than 2,000 Rand a month in February, were without a job in April, or even a job that they thought that they might return to in the next couple of weeks. And now we know from prior work what kinds of women in South Africa would have been earning less than 2,000 Rand a month in February, right? We know they would have been women working in small-scale informal sector businesses, in atypical kinds of jobs, piecemeal, casual, irregular work, and in low-skilled jobs, predominantly in the sectors that we know have been hit hardest by COVID. So think personal care, domestic work, hospitality, tourism, all the kinds of jobs that can't be performed easily remotely, and that were also severely restricted under those lockdown regulations in April, and that are typically very big employers of women, right? So the most vulnerable have been affected most. The third key finding I want to raise is that women across the spectrum have suffered under COVID. So I mentioned that half of women in the lowest third of the earnings distribution were without a job in April. But what was also very surprising to us was that 15% of women in the top third of the earnings distribution had also lost their jobs. So really no one has been left untouched by this crisis. And the last observation I want to make before I hand back to Marcel is to remind everyone that in addition to this massive shock that has happened in the labor market, there's also been a massive shock occurring in the home with school closures. In South Africa, we estimated that about 16 million children would have been home, either from school or an ECD center, who would have otherwise been cared for outside of the home. So that's between 5 and 9 extra hours a day that families with children would have had their kids at home with them. And it's not surprising, given that women were the primary caregivers to children pre-COVID in South Africa, that they would bear the brunt of this extra work that had to be done in April in terms of childcare. And so we found that women, because of living arrangements in South Africa, women are just way more likely to be living with children in the first place. But even when you look at only men and women living with children, you see that women are spending much longer hours on childcare than men. A particularly startling finding was that over half of women living with children, more like 60%, said they were spending 4 extra hours a day on childcare in April. Now that will affect their ability to go out and work, linking this back to the labor market, their ability to search for work if unemployed, and of course their ability to work sufficient uninterrupted hours, even at home, to earn a sufficient livelihood. And this has really dire implications for their ability, for their household socioeconomic well-being. I'm going to stop with that, and I can come back to kind of elaborate more on some points or discuss some of the policy responses later on.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Casale. Some great points to lay part of the foundation for this afternoon's discussion. We very much will take the opportunity to delve a bit deeper into them and then hear how that dovetails into the experiences of our other panelists as well throughout the afternoon. Before we do go on to one of our other panelists, just to remind all of the people who've joined us this afternoon, thank you so much for taking the time out to be a part of this discussion. And indeed, we want you to be a part of this discussion. You're not just sitting there watching this as a great reality television show. We want you to engage. There is a chat box on the right-hand screen of where you're watching right now. And quite a few of you are already making comments. Quite a few of you have told us that you are here and where you're from. We've got, for instance, Zara Gangan, who is a third-year Women and Gender Studies student. We've got somebody from Media 24. We've got somebody from the University of the Western Cape, from the International Relations Officer, Deborah Lamson. And we've also got various representatives of the various embassies in and around South Africa. I think probably mostly in Pretoria. So we thank you for your time, and various other people that I hope we will hear from throughout the afternoon. Some people involved in programs and networks specifically working in this field with women in business. So a really great gathering of viewers, participants, and panelists here this afternoon. And we will, of course, make time to engage with some of those questions that you are putting up there just once we really get the wheels turning on this discussion. Let's do that now by introducing you to Zora Madikizela. Zora, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, that gorgeous smile of yours. She is the Access to Finance expert for the EU-funded Ecosystem Development for Small Enterprise program. And quite interesting, I from what I understand, you two come from a more corporate background, as does Tracy Chambers, who we'll hear from a little bit later on. Zora, tell us a bit about the work that you're doing at the Ecosystem Development for Small Enterprises program, and what you've seen has been the impact specifically on those women that you're working with during these very unprecedented times that we're living through right now. Oh, unfortunately, Zora, we can't hear you. If you could perhaps turn your... Can anybody else hear Zora right now? Okay, unfortunately, we cannot hear Zora right now. I wonder if we could ask our tech expert, Sean, to perhaps help Zora sort out her audio issues. And while Sean and Zora do that, let me move on very swiftly to Tracy Chambers, who I hope I'll be able to hear from. Tracy is the CEO of the Clothing Bank, and she comes also from a more corporate background, 25 years experience in the corporate and social sector. She was a chartered accountant for many years, and in 2010 decided to jump off that ladder and start what many have come to know as the clothing bank. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Tell us a bit about where your head went to when you found out what our topic would be today.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us, and thank you to the EU delegation for the opportunity. They've always been great supporters of the Clothing Bank and their amazing commitment to women in South Africa. So I think for us, what I'm going to bring to the table today is really a perspective from the ground. What are women facing in poor communities in South Africa? So just to give you, for those of you who don't know the Clothing Bank, what we do is we work with unemployed mothers in South Africa, and we provide them with an opportunity to join a 2-year program, and in that program, at the early stages, they start running a business, and that business is trading in clothing that is donated by all of South Africa's major retailers. And we have amazing partnerships. We get over 100 million rands worth of product donated a year. Women get over 1,000 hours of training and mentoring. And part of that training is the opportunity to learn and earn at the same time and run a real business. We have about 800 women at any given time, between 800 and 1,000 women. To qualify for the program, she has to be unemployed at the time of joining, and she also has to be a mother, because we believe that if you help a woman, and if you help a mother, you help a child, and if we get a double impact, because that money will flow down. Our women represent the South African statistics. In South Africa, more than 60% of women are single mothers, and our women almost mirror that directly. More than half of the women in our program would not have finished school, and that also represents the statistics of South Africa. I also want to mention, because I'm going to bring it into the discussion, that we have a project that is a little bit younger. It's 5 years old, and it is called Grow Educare Centers. It's a franchise model for women running early learning centers in low-income communities to help convert those early learning centers into highly professional education facilities that are also sustainable businesses. And we have 43 centers in the early learning sector that support about 1,600 children on a daily basis. And I brought that into the discussion really because essentially the response from what's happening on the ground is actually a tale of two halves. So with the Clothing Bank and the traders, obviously we were very concerned when we went into lockdown as to what would the impact be on traders. And immediately, their ability to trade, which is, on the streets, if you want to put it that way, was limited as so many people's ability to earn was limited. A very important part of our program is developing financial literacy skills, and we have a very, very heavy focus on savings and managing your money to eradicate poverty and build wealth. And I think that is really what has stood most of our women in good stead. We always talk about having 3 months worth of savings in the bank account. And when we did our forecasts going into lockdown, we were very, very conservative, thinking that women would take a massive knock and that it would take a long time for them to recover. In reality, the women in our program recovered extremely quickly. Literally, the minute we opened our doors in level 4, fortunately, we were allowed to open our doors because we were selling winter clothing in level 4. There was a queue outside the door, and it's those savings that got them through, I think. We were able to provide a stimulus package, and I think it talks to the value of cash transfers and how they can really, for informal businesses, can make a massive, massive difference in getting people restarted. It's all about getting that, I always talk about it's like lighting a fire. Cash is the fire that, is the blitz on the fire. And once you get the cycle going in an informal business, you can and keep the cash going. You can get back on your feet very quickly. I think the other thing that's important to realize with the informal sector and we focus a lot on this in our training, is about building relationships with your customers. And what happened with lockdown and COVID is everything localized. People were shopping closer to home. Individuals were very concerned about getting on public transport because of the health risks. So instead of going to the mall, perhaps to do your shopping, you use the networks within your community, and actually that's what resulted in our women's businesses thriving. I think there were definitely positive impacts as a result of the ban on alcohol. Alcohol plays a very, very big role in consumption in the communities in which our women trade. A disproportionate amount of income in a family is spent on alcohol. And if I had to gather a group of women, as I did this morning, that is one of the things they wish actually could stay, because it has had such positive impacts. And yes, I know there are other impacts in terms of the formal economy, but it's certainly helping their businesses. So in the main, it's been a very positive story. And within the first months, we almost got 100% return rate from the women that were in our program prior to lockdown. And most of those women are completely back on their feet. They are telling us that the environment has gotten more competitive, obviously because people who were in the formal sector who now find themselves jobless, there's very low barriers to entry, and anybody can become an informal trader. So it's becoming more competitive, and they have to remain on their feet. We're also seeing the power of digital, and this sounds like sort of a little bit crazy in the informal sector. Where would digital play a role? But our women are very actively now using WhatsApp as a marketing tool, using quality photographs of their products and building databases of their customers, and almost cutting out the sort of street element and going directly to customers, and also very actively using Facebook as a marketing tool for their businesses. On the early learning side, on the ECD side, it's been completely the opposite. And it's very, very concerning picture. I'm sure many of you would have seen the silent protest that happened last week. And I think what really saddens me is how the early learning sector is critically important, as Dr. Kasale said, for women to be able to return to work. Yeah. And I really don't believe that our government has created an enabling environment to make that happen. There's been absolutely no support for the ECD sector. In fact, there has just been layers and layers and layers of complexity. They produced a 62-page document for compliance, which wasn't even in any of the official languages, that you needed a law degree to wade your way through. And I think there really has been a lot of obstruction in that industry. So whilst ECD centres are legally allowed to open, many cannot afford to open because they cannot comply with the regulations. There's obviously been a massive impact. There are more people at home able to take care of younger children who might just see ECD as a babysitting service rather than education. And the numbers that are returning, that is sort of across the board in the sector, is less than 20% of children that were enrolled prior to lockdown are returning, which means that that sector is teetering on the precipice of collapse. Centres are literally closing daily that might never open. Many women are getting themselves into debt, trying, particularly if they were covering rentals, trying to remain open in the hope that children will return. And there has been absolutely no support for the sector. And the silent protest last week was really that the government had decided to deploy 1.3 billion rand towards what they call COVID youth monitors, to monitor that the sector is implementing the COVID regulations, but could not find a cent, not 1 cent, to provide any relief for teachers and school owners. And from our experience, 90% of the women working in centres fall within that less than 2,000 rand a month bracket, and many of them are single mothers and are responsible for the well-being of their children in its entirety. And I think that's a great tragedy. It talks about 175,000 jobs in that sector that are at risk, and 1 million children who might not have anywhere to go back to if we don't act fast.
Okay, Tracy, thank you so much for that introduction. So many important issues that we still need to discuss there. I mean, that's even before we start talking about the many millions of children who were left without a square meal because the school nutrition program couldn't run or wouldn't run during the lockdown. So all of these issues just really impact on the next, and women specifically in South Africa at the core of so many of those factors that we've seen. Not just, it wasn't created during COVID-19, but very much magnified during this pandemic. So thank you so much for that introduction and giving us some insight into the lived experience of the women that we work with on a day-to-day basis. Let's try and see whether Zora Madikizela is with us now. Zora, can you hear me? Oh, no, we can't, unfortunately. She tried to reconnect with us. Let's just try that again. Have you unmuted your audio button? Unfortunately, we cannot hear her. So, okay, while Zora continues to try and sort out the joys of this new normal that we live in, we can bring everybody together in a beautiful space like this. But unfortunately, if the technical gremlins don't play along, then unfortunately we do have issues. Could I just, before we start really delving into some of the factors brought up by our panelists, I just want to bring Dr. Irina Kionka back into the discussion. Ambassador, if you don't mind, the EU ambassador to the Republic of South Africa. You know, we've heard over the last few months from medical experts who've said to me, from an anecdotal point of view, you know, as awful as this time is that we're living through and the challenges that we're facing, one of the positives to come out of this global pandemic is that there has been a networking and a sharing of experiences and information and studies and research across borders, across country, across continents in the medical field like never before. And they said they have never experienced that kind of working together amongst experts in the medical field, not worrying what country they come from or what university or hospital or medical organization that they work with. Everybody was sharing information because if they experienced something, they wanted to pass on that experience so that the next country waiting for that wave to come was ready and could learn from their experience. From where you stand with one foot, keeping an eye on what's happening back home in the European Union and being based here in South Africa, has that been a positive for you in your career as a diplomat, that you've been able to see a sharing of experiences as various countries try to battle this pandemic in the best possible way? Has that been something that you and your member states have been able to come to grips with and help each other get ahead of this virus?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that's absolutely the case, maybe on a very local level, but also at a global level. Locally, I can say that there was a real coming together among the various embassies of the European Union in this repatriation effort that we were running at the very start of the lockdown, because we had thousands of tourists who were stuck in South Africa when their flights were, canceled. And we worked together not only within the EU but with other partner countries. But when you talk about medical cooperation, then for sure this is something we've seen, not only that experts from amongst various countries are working together, but also across sectors. So this is a real effort of public-private partnership on developing a vaccine and looking at the most effective, most just way of rolling it out. And this is something that South Africa certainly has taken part in a global effort led by the EU that South Africa bilaterally and also as the chair of the African Union has taken a leading role on. It's real heartening to see that.
Okay, and from the experience of women and empowerment, the programs that the EU delegation in South Africa is involved in is very much focused on a strategic approach to empowering, especially women and those living in poverty. So that's not just handouts that are given, something that I know Tracy is very passionate about as well, but that you are involved in programs that really uplift not just the individual, but in doing so uplifts an entire community. But during the pandemic, we've seen the impact of this pandemic on such a large scale. How confident are you that the programs that the EU is involved with here can really make an impact at a time when it's really needed most?
Well, that's our aim. That's always our aim. And the reason we're strategic about focusing on women is exactly the reason that that Tracy brought out. When you enable one woman, one family, then you're actually hitting probably 3 generations. You're helping out probably 3 generations, if not more. And so that's it's a strategic choice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ambassador for the EU delegation in South Africa, Dr. Rena Kionka, giving us a bit of an understanding of why they choose specific programs to get involved in a way of empowering specifically women and how that can uplift a community. Now, speaking of which, Professor Kasala, if I could bring you in there, just to delve into some of the findings of that report that you were telling us about a little earlier. The one that I thought would really dovetail into the experiences that Tracy has told us about a little earlier as well. The big impact of women being the sole or the primary caregivers within their families. The first part of the report that you were part of also looks at the numbers of women who are single, who are raising their family on their own, who are in the large part either uneducated or vastly undereducated, and what impact that has on their ability to care for their families in the best possible way to ensure they get the education they need, they have food on the table, and they don't just become part of the statistic. But the caregiving of children is something, the unpaid caregiving. I feel like it's almost a phrase that we've heard more and more of now than we did ever before. The unpaid caregiving, that if a woman does not have somebody to look after her child or children at home, there's no way she can go out to go and earn a living. And that is something that has always been an issue in the vastly unequal society South Africa is. But in the middle of this pandemic, that has been vastly magnified, hasn't it?
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head there. I think what this crisis has done is it has exposed how important the unpaid care work that women do is, and how it is impossible to sustain an economy without that unpaid care work. And so it's not only valuable in and of itself, it's valuable for the economy more broadly. And women have been carrying that burden for a very long time. And I think what this crisis has done is that it's just shown how much of that work that they have to do. And with all families being at home, it's really given people within the household a bird's eye view of what happens on a daily basis when you're at home with kids. And something very interesting we found from our survey was that even though women were taking on the bulk of the extra childcare work during lockdown, many more men were reporting doing extra childcare work. So I think there's something, there's possibly a silver lining to this. If, this massive social experiment of forcing everyone to stay at home with their kids got men to do more, then hopefully that changes behavior longer term. It kind of transforms the way people think about who should be responsible for this kind of work. And even if people revert back to, what they were doing pre-COVID when the economy reopens, at the very least, I think it will change the way families and men hopefully value the childcare work that gets done in the home.
fascinating stuff there, and I feel like this would be a perfect opportunity to bring Tracy back into the discussion because Tracy, you really, based on what we've heard from Professor Kasale, that is actually in the block hole in the field that you are working with women on a daily basis, isn't it? Making it possible for women to make sure that they can care for their kids quite physically, obviously financially as well, educating them, and in that way making a positive impact. In terms of this unpaid caregiving, what has been some of the experiences that you've heard from your members, if I could call them that, during this pandemic? How difficult has it been for them? Other than you saying the ones that have been part of the program have already started their businesses, perhaps some of them that have not been a fully part of your business just yet, what are you hearing from them about what the experience has been in trying to come to a point where their kids are cared for and it allows them some kind of freedom to go out and make a living for those kids? Oh, Tracy, you're on mute. Here we go.
Apologies. As I've said, we've heard a little bit more of that through the early learning side of things. So, you know, these women live in communities, and with the sort of community being more at home, there is reliance on whether it's the extended family or a neighbor to care for her child. So we haven't seen that as a barrier. My concern is, do we necessarily know that our child is safe? You know, there's so much. We see it in the news every single day. You know, I trusted a neighbor, and you know, I don't want to think about some of the stories. And so I think a mother's anxiety levels do seem to increase if she doesn't necessarily able to take care of her child herself or place them in a trusted place like an early learning center that is well run and is safe. And at this stage, she doesn't necessarily have either of those. Often there's an undue burden on older children who are having to take care. So teenagers are left in the care. And sometimes it's not, you know, it's 10-year-olds that are then required to care for younger children. So the role of early learning is a very, very important place that really just hasn't been available to mothers or families for a much longer period than, or schooling hasn't been available for a much longer period of time than the workplace was shut down. And they weren't synchronous, you know, the workplace opened up, but the schooling didn't open up. And there was, you know, I'm a mother, and there was almost like a lack of acknowledgement. How was I supposed to go back to work when my child wasn't going back to school? It's just this magic thing that would take place that my child would take care of herself.
And that's not to say that if it is a household that does have another parent in it, that the other parent doesn't worry about those things. But unfortunately, these are still the stereotypical roles that are taken in traditional households, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And while you are, we do have the focus on you, Tracy, and we are talking about men. I found it quite fascinating. Over the last few years, you decided to take your clothing bank structure and apply it to a program that focused on men with the appliance bank, because there's an understanding in as much as women need to be empowered to take care of themselves, because so many are single moms. They don't have a present father for their children around them, for whatever the reason may be. Men are still a very important part of that community, and are suffering the brunt of a very, very seriously struggling economy as well. And what we hear time and time again from research being done is that people want to work. People want to put a decent day's work in to earn a living, to provide for themselves and for their families. And that has that's probably a topic for another webinar completely, the psychological impact of living a life of poverty and not being able to find a way out. And that's part and parcel of what you've had to deal with in starting the Appliance Bank, which focuses on empowering men to be able to learn a skill and to provide.
Yes, so that was a very important journey for us. We started and clearly had a vision and have a vision to help mothers and therefore help children. But we realized, that it was really important to touch the whole family. And so we helped the mother, we helped the child now through the early learning, and we now provide an opportunity to the father. And we started to see in relationships through the women that were joining us that there is major dignity in work. Absolutely. People want to work, people want to provide for their family and take responsibility for their family. And we opened the Appliance Bank about 6 years ago. And for us, it was quite a light bulb moment in that working with men for the first time, our program is a very deep program. We focus a lot on unlocking the human within who has suffered so much trauma and failure and rejection and has almost given up hope. And so it has become a very deep program, and we only had that program, so we applied that to our Appliance Bank group as well. And we were amazed at how we unlocked these men in the same way. And one of the key learnings that for us was a light bulb moment is that gender-based violence is a reality. We see our women are affected by it all the time, and the stories are harrowing that women have to go through what they go through in South Africa, just living in each community. And the light bulb moment for us is that we are not going to solve gender-based violence by working with women, because that man who is committing that crime is still in that community. We might get her out of that particular home, but he's going to go on to commit that crime with another woman unless we actually work directly with him. And so our program with men has actually become quite a strong focus on talking about these issues amongst men. And a number of men in our program have gone on to recruit, to actually run men's programs in their community and saying, hey, we need to talk about this. We need to stop this. And only we have the power to stop this. So it's been incredibly rewarding to be able to do that work, which is certainly not part of our initial vision, but I think that's really the way of it. And once the man that we're working with finds his dignity in being able to provide for his family, he's much more open to having these conversations. Whereas, when he's really fighting for survival, that fight shows up in different ways, and that might be, in some of the ways that we're seeing that play out in society. So it's been a fantastic program for us to start engaging on those very important issues.
Tracy Chambers, there is a CEO of the Clothing Bank, some fascinating programs that they've seen come of the program that they started back in 2010 and continuing to do great work in various communities across South Africa. Let's see if we can bring Zora Madikizela into the conversation now. Zora, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah, technology. And now I feel like a pilot, as the ambassador said, with the headphones on.
I was going to say Janet Jackson, but okay. Zora, you are the Access to Finance expert for the EU-funded Ecosystem Development for Small Enterprise program. Now, I'm not an expert in that field, but it sounds like your job is pretty important because it deals with money. Tell us from your vantage point, what has been the effects of the crisis on women-owned businesses specifically? And we'd be talking, you can talk both about the formal as well as the informal sector, which we know has really suffered a huge amount as a result of this pandemic and lockdown.
Thank you, Marcel, and glad to be here and for the opportunity. I think one of the things that we have seen, and I'm trying to pick up some of the threads of the discussion so far, is that a lot of the women-owned businesses in particular have been very affected in terms of their operations since the pandemic started. And in fact, a recent study shows that South African women are still in the minority in terms of the entrepreneurial landscape, and they account for less than a third of entrepreneurs. And I think one of the keys, if we're looking at the financing of women entrepreneurs, and this is probably also common to other male entrepreneurs as well, but the limitation of access to finance, I think, is a greater issue amongst women entrepreneurs than it is for males, even globally. So, for instance, if one looks at the unmet needs of women-owned businesses worldwide, the estimates there are about 260 billion, between 260 billion to about 320 billion, just highlighting the need to have lending products that are geared towards women. And I think the other issue that I found interesting is that studies have shown that female entrepreneurs all over the world are deemed to be a lower risk, and the rate of non-performing loans is much lower for women-owned businesses because they're consistently reliable in terms of maintaining their credit. And I know recently Business Partners was highlighting this fact with their own portfolio of businesses in general. One of the things that we have been working on as the EDSE program is working closely with the Small Enterprise Financing Agency. This is an agency of the Department of Small Business, which took a very active role in terms of assisting businesses that had gone into distress because of the lockdown by launching various funding initiatives that were targeted, most of them to the informal sector. I heard earlier from one of the panelists some of the challenges and how bleak things were, especially for those bottom third of entrepreneurs who are, some are formal, some are informal, who are impacted most. So to date, they would have funded about 467 million on COVID emergency relief. And of that, 45% is targeted towards women-owned businesses. And one of the things that they've done is they've looked at specific subsectors in the informal sector where they can play the greatest impact in terms of sustaining those businesses. The one that comes to mind is the Spaza Shop Support Scheme, which was launched in April. It was literally a month after the lockdown, which allows Spaza Shop owners to access funding for the purchase of discounted goods, but also through a process, be able to eventually access credit with commercial banks, with the intention that there could be a partnership with one of the entities of the department through CIFA that would provide a credit guarantee type instrument. And this is something that's unique because if you think about it, most of those Spaza Shop owners would have had to shut down because of the effect of the lockdown, but also because of this initiative, you now suddenly had people being able to access goods closer to home and not having to travel for far distances to secure basic amenities, and also countering the impact of spreading of the coronavirus disease. They've also looked at other sectors that are in motion, and I think you spoke about hairdressers and personal care workers who literally had to close their businesses and had no income for the last 3 to 4 months. And most of them, because they were informal, were not able to access some of the schemes or initiatives of government, and therefore they were the most affected. I think one of the other thing one can look at is that, broadly speaking, if one then looks at the private sector, there were a lot of funding initiatives coming out of there, and most of it was geared towards the procurement of PPE or that's protective equipment. and also the manufacture of that. But you'll find that there are some specific funds, there were not that many, that specifically targeted women entrepreneurs in particular. For instance, the ones that were traditionally there, you can look at some of the funding that the NEF has in terms of its women-owned fund. I know Business Partners as an entity has a women's fund that provides funding, but also provides grant for non-financial support. Then there are various others that I can mention, such as the Old Mutuals Masisizane Fund, which is also a women-focused fund. So I think, just so that before I end off myself, the reality is that COVID will permanently reshape many aspects of the world as we know it now. So many of the businesses or their models that have worked previously may not work at all from today onwards. So business owners need to not only adapt to the new normal, but use this as an opportunity to future-proof their operations. Over to you, Masha.
Thank you so much for that, Zora. If I could keep you in focus there just for a second, because you're speaking specifically there about people that are already partaking in the economy as business owners, as entrepreneurs. But I remember speaking to a specific youth employment accelerator a couple of months ago. And the fascinating research that they focused on was the reasons, the how people become entrepreneurs or try to become entrepreneurs. And they too found a huge distinction between the reasons why a man was to become an entrepreneur and the reasons why a woman is to, especially young women, are to become an entrepreneur. And I mean, this is obviously just one small research, but I found it fascinating because they said that young men would become entrepreneurs because they want to. And perhaps they've got more access to these various funds and programs. Women invariably become entrepreneurs because they need to, because they've got no other option. And Tracy, I'll come to you about that a little bit later on as well. How have you found that to be true as well? And how difficult has it been for somebody in your field and the space that you work in to encourage women to say, you can do this? Here is the program. We will help you. Here are the funds. Because many of them also saying, we didn't even know those facilities are there. We didn't know that funding was there. What are some of the experiences that you're hearing from women in that field?
Yeah, I think one has to just look at the barriers that influence women being able to access funding. And I think a lot of the time you find that they would lack basic knowledge on how to raise funding. And if you look at how banks approach the way in which you can apply for funding, you need to have a business plan and. And the other barrier that I can mention is that there's one of finance readiness, and that speaks to the types of documents that banks require of entrepreneurs. A lot of the time, you find that female entrepreneurs in particular may not be financially savvy or feel comfortable or confident enough in terms of looking at issues around financial statements, etc. So I think that's another barrier. But the third one, I think, and this is key, is that lenders have certain credit scoring and risk assessment models in which they use to assess SME lending risk. And a lot of the time they rely on credit records and collateral to assess those applications. You will find that, especially if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, a lot of those women don't have collateral, or they already have impaired credit records. So I think what you tend to then find is a lot of those women, especially in some funding sectors, like if you look at microfinance sectors, where you predominantly find women are able to access funding because of the nature of the structure of the products that are created, which are basically pro-poor. And for instance, if you look in the lockdown, these institutions have provided over, I think, 184,000 loans. And of that, 97% is to female-owned entrepreneurs. So if you compare that with, for instance, the government, the 200 billion facility that was launched in May, where uptake has been poor. Only 14 billion of that has been funded. And I think the average loan size they were talking about is about 1.2 million. So it is a hindrance, but I think one of the areas where we will start unlocking some of these issues is through financially enabled platforms where women entrepreneurs are targeted in particular.
Professor Kasala, if I could bring you in there, because what we're also generally now talking about there is gender inequality. So Zora speaking about the barriers that specifically women have to face, trying to access funding, trying to get through the red tape. The research that you would have found in the labor market, you spoke about earlier, you touched on the fields that generally or in large part employ women are the ones that were impacted the most heavily by the coronavirus. And in the year 2020, we're still sitting in a world where women are seen to be doing this type of work in that kind of industry in large numbers. And therefore, if those industries are impacted by something like the coronavirus, not only do they suffer the brunt of it, but so do their families, and then generally the community, and the list goes on.
Absolutely. And so I think to support women, we not only should be looking at supporting their businesses, but we should be supporting women to access different kinds of higher paying jobs, outside of entrepreneurship, in the paid economy as well. So not every woman can be an entrepreneur. And, I think that starts very early on with public messaging at schools, ensuring that girls feel comfortable taking the STEM subjects, and they're encouraged to take the STEM subjects, and that they continue to take them also at the university level. Because what we find is that actually girls are more likely to graduate with a matric, more likely to graduate with an undergraduate degree now at university than boys, but they are still underrepresented in the STEM fields. And they're still less likely to go beyond their undergraduate degree to their postgraduate degree. So something is blocking women. They're doing well in education, but they're not going for some of the higher paying fields, and they're not progressing beyond the undergraduate level to the postgraduate level, again, to kind of social norms, social messaging, and also the childcare story. By the time young women maybe get to their postgraduate degree level, childbearing years kick in. And then they're torn between these two areas of their life. And so I think that we kind of always keep coming back to the childcare story. How do we get women into entrepreneurship, get women into good paid employment, at the same time as supporting them to support their children? If we don't have better social care infrastructure, like Tracy mentioned, good ECD, good quality and safe ECD centers that are well funded, how do we get women to be able to study further in the more intensive fields, and to be able to take on jobs where they're required to work long hours sometimes?
If I could just also remind those who are participating by watching this webinar, don't forget you can put some, I'm going to get to your questions in just a little bit. We've got about a half an hour left of this discussion. So please do put your inputs in that chat box or questions and say who you would like to hear from. And also to our panelists, don't forget you can put up your hand and say, I disagree with Zora, or I agree with Zora, or Ambassador, if you feel there's a subject that you can make an input in, just indicate or just jump in. We're not precious here. Tracy, if I could bring you in there. Oh, can we get the Ambassador to speak just very quickly, Tracy? I won't forget you're coming up next. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, Tracy. I think our hands went up at the same time. I wanted to make 2 points in response to what the professors just said. Most of my work on gender mainstreaming has been in the crisis management field of security, international security. And from there, we know that there's a 30% rule. And the 30% rule is that once there's, in a group, in a team, there are 30% who are women, the dynamics change, and the possibilities actually to rise up in the organization are dramatically enhanced. And so one of the things I think we need to do just collectively and globally is past that 30%. In any team, in any club, in any gathering of human beings. The second thing I wanted to add was how do you get there? And there's much to be said for representation. This is a discussion we've seen very much earlier in the gender area, but also, for instance, on racism questions. Once there's a representational aspect, you see people, women in high places, then that already kind of spurs young children, young girls and boys, to say, oh, I can be that. I can get there too. And it's extremely important. I mean, once I was asked whether who are my role model, who have my role models been through the years, and I had not a single woman that I could name, because there weren't any. There weren't any then. And I have had so many people tell me now that it makes a huge difference if you can actually visualize someday having this kind of goal. Thank you.
And that's exactly where I want to bring Tracy in, because Tracy, I know a big part of what drives you, and I think your co-founder's name is Tracy as well, is getting across to the women who join your program to believe that they can do it, that they don't just have to work in a service industry where they get paid a salary by somebody by doing a task of some kind. Tell us what you've then come across in that lack of self-belief amongst our women in our various communities, that disbelief that they can do this thing that they've never seen other women around them do because of the history of South Africa.
I think, Marcel, you hit the nail on the head. If you've never seen somebody do it, then you don't believe it's possible. And the power of role modeling is incredible. So when we started the Clothing Bank 10 years ago, if I brought a group of 100 women into a room and I said to you, how many of you, and we're talking South African women, born and bred in South Africa, and I said to them, how many of you would like to run your own business? Now, bearing in mind they were applying for a program for a business, versus how many of you would like to get a job, and given the education qualifications, I use the example as a cashier at Woolworths. Those were the two choices. And 10 years ago, 90% of people put up their hands and said, I just want a job. I just want a job. If I ask that same question today, 90% of the women who are applying for a program are saying, I'm done. I know that that's a dead-end job. I believe I can do more, and I want to have the opportunity to be self-employed, to be flexible, and I know that I can create more wealth. Now, for me, that's a massive mind shift change in South Africa, and is exactly what we set out to do, is to shift the mindset that women can control their own wealth creation, and that your underlying lack of access to quality education doesn't have to be a life sentence of poverty, that can be changed. And self-employment is a great way to do that. So as we've gone on, people come and join our program, and it's quite funny actually, because often women in the program don't want other women to join the program, and we've had women follow their neighbor in the taxi behind to find out where's she going and how she's been successful. And for me, that's role modeling. That says, you know what, she was just like me. She had the same struggles as me. Look what she's become, and I want to become that too. And so that's how the world works. We follow, what we see as the opportunities to grow and develop ourselves. So we actually have an ambassador program in our program where we keep women on who've been successful, who want to help other women, and they are part of the journey of inducting our new women. They're journeying alongside them to build that confidence, to give them the encouragement in the moment where they're feeling that they can't do this, because the I can't mindset took a long time to overcome. You need quite a lot of success The first time you think, that was just luck. The second time you think, yeah, well, maybe next time I'll fail. And until you get to a belief system where you start to believe that you can and that you deserve prosperity. I wanted to bring in one point that I think, some of the questions here. One of the things that for me struck me throughout this lockdown is the importance of access to digital.
Yeah.
We wanted to use this downtime as an opportunity for everybody to do upskilling. Now, if I want to learn anything today, Google's my friend, and I can learn how to change a tire, I can learn crochet. Absolutely anything is available on the internet free, except if you don't have an unlimited fiber content.
Yep.
This call, we did research. This call alone, if you were not on a data package, unlimited data package, cost you 150 Rand. So the ability for women to work from home digitally is literally impossible if we don't start to address the new barrier. It becomes a new barrier to entry. I know of massive call centers that took that work home and literally gave everybody a computer on the 27th of March and said, go and work from home. You can't do that if you don't have a reliable internet service at 150 Rand an hour. It's impossible.
Exactly.
So we have to address that issue. It's becoming a critical issue that everybody needs access to the digital economy, and therefore we could fast track. For me, if there's one thing we learn from this, we can learn the power of digital. We're all sitting here having a great conversation where we would have to hire a room, drive in our cars, get there. We're able to fast track this. And we need to use this as an opportunity to fast track our education system, to fast track access to great knowledge so that individuals that didn't have the opportunity to go to the best school or the best university can take care of that themselves. And we could really fast track everything in terms of the inequality that we have in this country.
That actually brings us, one can actually bring two questions from our chat room together in that. There was an earlier comment from Mpundo Kalana, who said it would be great to also recognize that we expect women to be digitally inclined. We refer to 4IR all the time. Most times it sounds like we've forgotten that the very same people we expect to measure up are the same people who have been marginalized. And there you've spoken about how you've already seen the impact of being digitally empowered and what impact that's had on your member women in growing their business and allowing them to advertise and to market their goods and to access their clients in an easier way. So no access to a smartphone, for instance, then already puts them on a back foot yet again. And then also, Zora, a question for you here from Heather Wynn. She says it will be interesting to know if there is a provision in place that seeks to cater for women living in rural areas where there's no access to internet and other resources, including certain skills. Now, again, in as much as in the major parts of South Africa, you've got a lot of these programs running, but the real impact also we do need to see are in our rural areas where, unfortunately, too often they are cut off from things like the internet or are unable to access a gadget that allows them to get to the resources that they need to really get the ball rolling in the business that they specifically want. Is that something that you can speak to? Are you seeing any of that changing in any way, shape, or form? Zora, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. So just in a nutshell, I mean, women living in rural areas will say, oh, this is all well and good. You've got all these wonderful programs, but a lot of that focus is normally in the metro areas, and we don't have access to them, and we don't have internet. We don't have the gadgets that we need. How far are we from a place, as we try and move forward looking and how we can solve some of these issues, how far away are we from ensuring that these ecosystems that we're creating also include women in the rural areas who perhaps don't have access to those important resources like the internet or mobile phones or gadgets?
Thanks for that, Marcel. I think it is a big challenge, specifically for female micro SMEs in rural areas in particular. And I think there are various initiatives that government would be looking at in terms of bringing those entrepreneurs into the fold. But I think the main issue is that if you look specifically around access issues, one of the key considerations is that a lot of the more successful funding type of institutions are the ones who are going to move digital. But obviously, there's still that challenge of access within rural areas specifically.
And it's obviously something that we're going to have to approach in a far bigger way, because I think if anything has brought to the attention of those in decision-making positions is the need for affordable data and access to things like the internet. This pandemic that we've lived through has really done that in leaps and bounds. I think our members of parliament who have struggled with Zoom committee meetings, if they don't know now that we need better internet and more access to the internet, then I don't know what will bring that home. Daniela, if I could bring you in here, if we look at, we've got about 15 minutes left of our discussion now, the response to the pandemic and for the purposes of this discussion, the impact on women, the response to it. I remember the fight that so many organizations like the Child Legal Center, I think it is, that's connected to UCT, had on their hands in trying to get more money into the social grants, because that was the easiest way to get money into households that really desperately needed it. Because again, that study that you were part of said in February, families had money for food, and in March, millions of families didn't have money for food. And so a lot of these organizations took up the fight and said the best and easiest way to do this right now is to increase the amount of money that the child social grants are able to access for children. What did you make of the policy and structural responses to this great need for South Africans in need during the pandemic?
I think that the social grants are absolutely crucial. I think that what was so, in a way, where South Africa was lucky was that we have a well-developed social grant system or social protection system. And so we were able to access people relatively quickly by topping up the grants. Lots of other developing countries don't have access to that kind of system, and they couldn't reach people very quickly. I still think we were caught, though, unawares, in the sense that, there were only the top-ups to the grants were only introduced, I think, in May. And let's face it, people live in this country from day to day or week to week, not even month to month. And so by delaying those months and only implementing them in May, people were already in a bad position. And so you rightly pointed out that our study showed that in April, almost half of women said that their households had run out of money to buy food, right? And about 1/4 of women's households, they said someone had gone hungry in the previous 7 days. So, the social grants were so important, but they came too late, the top-ups. And I also want to raise my concern about the value of the top-ups. A lot of people are under the impression that many South Africans only live off of grants. That's not true. Many grant-receiving households supplement their income from grants with income from employment, small-scale employment maybe, but still that income from employment is important. And for many families, actually, that are receiving the grant, income from employment is their main source of income. With all the job losses we recorded, there is no way that the top-ups of the grants would have been able to make the lost employment income. So families were very quickly thrown into destitution. Add to that the lack of the school feeding scheme, add to that rising food prices. People have really battled these last few months. And so I would say that the value of the top-ups was not sufficient. I know that we have fiscal constraints, but we really should not be leaving our most vulnerable without a sufficient income. And the second thing I want to £50 a month.
Sorry, Daniela, just pick up there. We lost you for a second. Your last point there.
Am I back? Am I
yes,
back?
you are. Yes, you are. Your last point there.
The second point that I wanted to raise was about the new COVID grant, the new social relief of distress grant for R350 a month. The recent data coming out of SASSA suggests that 2/3 of those new grants have gone to men, even though women were responsible for 2/3 of the job losses. Now, what we think is happening is that you can't hold that new unemployment grant at the same time as a child support grant. And so what's effectively happening is that you're penalizing unemployed women for also looking after their children, because that child support grant is for the child. And we know that the 440 Rand for the child a month is not even enough to raise a child above the food poverty line in South Africa, or 570 Rand. So how is it also supposed to, feed a mom who's lost her job as well as men? So, I would say that the size of the grants is not enough, and they're also, the new grants are discriminating against women. Personally, I think we should be talking about a basic income grant, a universal income grant, so that we don't leave anyone, outside of the social protection net. But maybe I'll leave it there, and others might have views on the basic income grant that are different. Yeah.
Tracy, there was quite a bit of nodding of the head from you as Daniela was speaking. I feel like in your experience, you probably have also been able to see women go from depending on that social grant, because what this pandemic has brought up is the fragility of when you're with the situation where millions of people depend on the social grant, and the fragility of it not being enough because of a pandemic, and what impact that can have on such a wide scale. You would have probably, in your experience, have seen women go from depending on that social grant for every need to not depending on it, because you've been able to help them empower themselves to provide for themselves in a real meaningful way. Oh, you're muted, Tracy. You're muted. They say that is the new proverb. They say it's one of the proverbs of the pandemic. You're muted. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Poverty eradication is our goal, and the day that a woman in our program no longer, in fact, gives up that child grant so that somebody else can benefit from us is means we've achieved success. And in a very, very large, it's something we measure. In a very, very large proportion of the cases, she is able to do that. And that's great cause for celebration. I wanted to mention, and what does she spend her money on? I just saw that question pop up. What are the benefits for economic empowerment? Well, particularly for women, she spends her money on her children. The first thing she spends her money on is her home, which is to create a safe and nurturing environment for her children. And actually, the second thing that we see her spend money on is her children's education. So increasingly, women understand that the ticket out of poverty is likely to come through giving their child the quality education that they didn't. And unfortunately, in South Africa, that often means private education. And so we increasingly see a woman spending a very large proportion of her newfound wealth on education, so that her child will be the first generation, perhaps, to go to university, etc. So yeah, it's and the other thing I wanted to talk about is we participated in a Treasury meeting where Treasury were desperately looking for how to deploy this additional grant to the informal sector. And that was a massive, massive gap that was highlighted. There was no mechanism that they could find to support the informal sector. So there is a massive gap between what we would call small business, that perhaps is digitally, has records, has credit history, and is able to access the finance that Zora spoke about. and the informal sector, which is largely undocumented. Even within the ECD says there are 35,000 ECDs, and the Department of Social Development did not have a database. They had to quickly launch a Google Forms to basically find out how many ECDs we have. And I think we need to get better at documenting what the landscape is and having databases so that we can be more responsive and find better mechanisms to provide the right finance at the right time.
You're on mute, Marcel.
You've been waiting to say that all day. Thank you so much. It was bound to happen. Thank you so much.
Of course, one of us at least once.
I know. So we've got the last few minutes together, and I think especially the last half an hour, without me asking you to do so, you've really been able to put the spotlight on the hot spots where we can have interventions that ensure that if we ever were to live through something like this again, that we're not caught in such a bad position. Well, there's the hope that it could. But I think just for the last few minutes that we are together, I'll give you each an opportunity to talk, just explain to us where you think the most important hotspots are for us to be in a position where women specifically do not again bear the brunt of a global pandemic or a global event or an economic crisis such as the one that we're living through, that we were actually living through before coronavirus actually arrived in South Africa. Zora, if I could start with you. For those who joined a bit late, Zora is the access to finance expert for the EU-funded ecosystem development for small enterprise program. And Zora, if I'm correct, you do come from a corporate background that included in the field of healthcare and education as well, which really puts you in the perfect position to discuss this topic today. From where you stand now, as you're in a position to help empower women and to find a life outside of poverty and to make a better life for their families, from your experience and what you've seen during this pandemic, what for you would be one or two of the most important factors that we need interventions in to ensure that we don't live through these exact same experiences going forward?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think the main issue is if you're looking, and I keep going back to the bottom of the pyramid, because those are the people that if they, one, are not employed or they are not in some form of small business, whether it's formal or informal, are the ones that then end up being in the social security net and have to rely on grants. So I think one of the key areas or key initiatives must be to ensure that we provide opportunities to entrepreneurs in that particular space so that they are able to then graduate and move into a space where they are able to access credit and grow businesses, etc. Because once you grow those SMEs, if you look at it systemically in the ecosystem, you are able to create employment out of those SMEs. So I think that's one of the key takeaways for me. But I think the other issue is the sudden realization, I think it was Tracy who touched on it, of the fact that we are moving digital. And for all those entrepreneurs that are in rural areas and don't have access, what sort of interventions can we have that will support those people and bring them into the net as far as being involved in business? Because we've seen a lot of examples in other parts of the world, East Africa, for example, where you have very successful microfinance enterprises that are funding in that space. So I'll pause there. Thank you, Marcel.
Professor Kasale, women, Black women specifically, manual workers, those at the bottom half of the income distribution, suffered disproportionately as a result of this pandemic. Just one of the shocking findings of that report that you are a part of. I can't wait to see all. I know that sounds terrible, but the second part of this report will be coming out soon as well. And it's really given us an opportunity to go to the heart of the issues of South Africa's vast socioeconomic issues. Your takeaways from this time that we're living through and where interventions are needed so desperately going forward.
Right. I mean, I think that, even before COVID, I would have said
Yes.
good quality childcare support, more so with COVID and, school closures that we've seen. So, and the reason for this is because without having good quality childcare available for women, they won't easily be able to take up the opportunities that we make available to them. So we're talking about empowering women and making opportunities available to them in the labor market and in terms of entrepreneurship. But we still have to figure out what they should be doing with their children. And we can't always expect women to rely on other friends and family. For some women, that extended family support is not available. And if we don't provide it, it means that we are relegating women to that constant double burden of being responsible to support their families financially, but also to physically care for them. And that has detrimental effects, obviously, on women's well-being, socioeconomic, but also mental, physical, and health-wise, right? So we should be looking at how we can support children and therefore support women to access opportunities, that would be my takeaway. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I'm sure you would mirror a lot of what the professor has shared there, but going by your experience, it's not always just one simple intervention, is it?
No, we need to work with the whole woman. We need to work with the whole person, no matter what work we're doing, because to be successful running your own business is significantly more difficult than being in formal employment in a fixed job description. Running your own business, you have to be multi-skilled. And the one point that I wanted to make in the South African context, how do we get more women running, more small businesses, medium-sized businesses? How do we get more South Africans doing that? We know we need to do that. And the biggest challenge that I see is that we have an incredibly onerous legislative framework for businesses in South Africa. It's not an enabling environment. I think you have to be an expert in 35 laws that are very punitive. And so therefore the very laws that were designed so that we never repeated our history to protect people are the very laws that are actually keeping people out. Because you have to be a professional lawyer and a professional accountant, a professional health and safety officer in order to run a business these days. Believe me, I do this, and it's extremely scary to be able to actually, confidently comply with all the professional labor lawyer, etc., etc. And we have to look at that. Until we address that, inequality in South Africa will remain, because unless we fix education and everybody gets the opportunity to become that professional, it's literally impossible to grow a business without those skills, because of the legislative framework in which business operates. So that would really be my big takeout, is that so many businesses couldn't access the finance that was available because they weren't formalized, because they didn't qualify, they didn't know how to be formalized, they didn't have the skills necessary and the money. There's a great cost to formalization, in terms of having to comply. So I think as a country, we certainly need to address that with the most urgency.
Tracy Chambers there, the CEO and co-founder of the Clothing Bank. Thank you so much for that great insight. Dr. Rina Kionka, you've been multi-skilling while we've been jabbering away. You were answering some questions on the chat room there. There was a question earlier about support for migrant women, and you answered there saying on the question of support to migrant women who do not get grants from South Africa, we are working with the IOM to help on that front, as well as helping those who want to get home. So the IOM would be the ones to turn to. Also, there was talk of the red tape. Tracy spoke about the red tape and all of the hoops that so many women have to jump through just to start a business or to access funding. I also know that that's part and parcel about what people like Zora and her team at the Ecosystem Development for Small Enterprise Program, they work quite a bit on removing as much of that red tape as possible at the EU-funded program that they run there. Dr. Kionka, thank you so much for hosting us. Your takeaways from today's discussion and your hope for this space that women are suffering through right now.
Number one, we need to enhance digital. Number two, we need to grow those women entrepreneurs. And number three, we all of us on the screen, those of us listening, we all need to be the change. So we need to be mentors, represent, be a role model. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I couldn't have said it better myself. Dr. Rina Kionka, the EU ambassador to the Republic of South Africa. Thank you so much for those words. And thank you for the commitment from you and your delegation and for hosting this webinar. And thank you for joining us today, Agora Madikizela, Professor Daniela Casale, and of course, Tracy Chambers from the Clothing Bank. That has been your Women's Month webinar, the EU delegation in South Africa and Mail and Guardian, bringing you this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on women and their businesses. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your participation. And if you are wanting to watch this webinar, it is available, I believe, on the Mail and Guardian's YouTube. And if you want to find out about other webinars, you can go onto the Mail and Guardian's website. They're a busy bunch over there with all their webinars. They've really come to terms with the new normal and really getting South Africa talking during a time that we need it most. So do take care, be safe, wear your mask and social distance as we try and get on the other side of this pandemic. Do take care and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.